it shifted for me. And the sermon was no longer just about how am I helping people structure and form their beliefs, or how am I helping people grow spiritually or grow in maturity. The sermon became for me more about how am I forming a congregation. And so that really flipped a lot, because then I would start thinking more about, and I talked earlier about structure. For me, the primary piece of every sermon that I wanted to preach was I wanted to get to a place where I spoke some sort of calling over our congregation. Like, we as a people are called to be this.
Hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast, episode 172. I'm your host, Mike Neglia. Well, you're about to be introduced to a bit of a role model to me. John Chandler is not only a thoughtful and gifted preacher in his own right, he also has a heart that's geared towards care and spiritual formation, both to the congregations that he has pastored and led, and also he's interested in the care and the formation of preachers like you and me. Now, John has been serving preachers for a long time. Years ago, back before everyone had a podcast, he had one called Sermonsmith. And guys, that's my favorite podcast that ever has existed. In fact, it really kind of inspired what you're hearing and benefiting from right now. So I was glad to be able to meet him, to speak to him about the Sermonsmith podcast, and also ways that he's interested in preparing and guiding and shepherding pastors and leaders now through his work as a spiritual director. Well, this conversation is a lot of fun. I know that you really are going to enjoy it. But I do want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by the Calvary Global Network International Conference. It's coming up at the end of this month, June 28th, going until July 1st. And the speaking lineup includes some previous guests on this podcast. Gavin Ortland and Pam Markey are speaking at the conference, and they have made their way through the Expositors Collective Podcast, and now they're hitting the big leagues. So here is an ad for the conference, and immediately following, you're going to hear my conversation with John Chandler.
The theme of the 2021 CGN International Conference is The Way of Jesus. This past year has presented challenges that transcend society and culture, but it didn't change the mission of God to rescue His alienated creation via the person and work of Jesus Christ. As we press into the way of Jesus, we want to approach culture the way that Jesus did. Concepts like human dignity, justice, wisdom, and power are at the forefront of conversations in our culture like never before. Are we understanding and engaging in this dialogue from a worldly definition of these ideas, or do we operate according to the model, message, and method that Jesus gave us in the Gospels? Joining us this year as we dialogue about the way of Jesus are Gavin Ortland, author and missiologist Alan Hirsch, John Jenkins, pastor of First Baptist Church in Glenarden, Maryland, author and YouTube host Beckett Cook, missionary and Bible college director Pam Markey, and many more. Sessions will feature live dialogues and Q&As with the speakers, and our interactive in-person and online specialized training tracks focus on various aspects of ministry leadership, including the posture of the church in an age of hate, the way of Jesus in a sexually broken culture, spiritual health for spiritual leadership, women in the way of Jesus, and more. The CGN International Conference will be online and in person at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa from June 28th through July 1st. Registration is open to pastors, church leaders, lay leaders, volunteers, men, women, anyone called to serve Christ and His kingdom. To register and for more information, visit our website at conference.calvarychapel.com. That's conference.calvarychapel.com. We hope to see you there.
Hey, welcome to the Expositors Collective Podcast. I have the privilege of speaking with John Chandler. John, good morning. Welcome. Glad to have you here.
Good evening.
Yeah, good. Well, for me, it's 4:26 for me,
okay.
And I know that it's different for you. So, Ireland is connecting with Arizona right now, and thank you for including me. So I know you a lot more than you know me. You are the host of my favorite podcast, or one of the early favorites. You hosted the Sermonsmith podcast. And what caused you to start that podcast?
Yeah. So that was in the early stages of my own church starting our public gathering. And I had been church planting, but we had been in an incubating stage for a long time. And so I was just thinking a lot about, what is my sermon preparation process going to look like? That was going to be the first season of my life where I was preaching that regularly. You know, my prior roles had always been an associate pastor or a youth pastor where I was teaching regularly. But so I was just thinking a lot about, how am I going to work this in? I was bivocational. I worked part-time for the church, and I did freelance work on the side as well. And at the same time, I just have always been interested in talking about creative processes, not just sermons, but any kind of creative. Like, I'm always curious, how do writers get writing done? You know, how do people who make music, what does their process look like? And so I realized that all those interests were merging, and I kept finding myself asking some of my other pastor friends, how do you do sermon prep? You know, when I was at a conference, or even when I was just catching up with somebody on the phone, and I realized this is a really interesting conversation to me. And I don't know how interesting it's going to be to other people. Maybe it will be, maybe not. But I really like this conversation. And so I just decided I was going to turn it into a podcast and started inviting people. And it was interesting to get feedback from people who I invited, because some of them were just really into it. And you can even sense their energy, maybe as you listen to some of the old episodes. Tim Keel was one of my early ones that stands out to me. He was so energized by the conversation. There were some people who turned me down, and they said, I didn't even know how I would begin to talk about that. So
I feel the same way. So when was that? What was the year? It was back when podcasting was a little more rare. I mean, these days, you know, 2020 was the year that spawned 10,000 podcasts. You know, everyone started their own podcast, did 7 or 8 episodes, and then dropped it. But you started, what year was that?
That was 2013.
2013. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I remember finding it, and I guess maybe just to say to the listeners to this podcast that don't know exactly what we're on about, or if the introduction didn't clue you in, essentially what you're listening to now, the Expositors Collective, is kind of like a loving homage to the Sermonsmith podcast, or we're the cover band that is kind of playing a tribute to what John did. I found that podcast. I listened to every episode. I went back and binged. There's some that I've listened to multiple times, because I'm geared in a very similar way, maybe interested in the process of sermon preparation and even delivery. And all of a sudden, like, it just kind of slowed down, and then somewhat kind of ground to a stop. Yeah. And I thought, oh man, like, John has like the coolest like gig or hobby or whatever, to be able to have these conversations about the sermon process, which seems so interesting to me. He gets to do it over and over and over again. And I thought, like, I wish I could do that. And then thought, well, wait a minute, maybe I can. And this podcast kind of became that. And then again, as you guys have kind of stalled out or are retiring on episode 97, I hope to be able to carry that Olympic torch to the next. Anyway, so I'm a big
you can
huge
just
fan.
Build on it and take it further and make it better, please.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the first time I ever like created, like, I ever was a Patreon supporter of any podcast was for this one, because I'm like,
thank you.
This is really great. I love this, and so forgive me for geeking out, but
and now as a podcaster, you know how valuable that support for your time investment can be.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Well, I actually don't. We don't do that yet.
You don't do it. Yeah,
maybe
it's helpful.
Yes. And so I said first, not only, but and so if you guys, if you're listening podcast world and you benefit from other podcasts and they have a Patreon, maybe consider a couple bucks a month. Okay, so of those 97 episodes, John, that you did, is there something that you remember the most, or was there something that impacted you the most spread across those 97 conversations?
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few things that hit me at different times, and it certainly helped me kind of tune. I definitely had a comfort level and a flow that worked for me, but I found I kept adjusting it and I kept tuning it a lot. Of course, this is obvious, but at the same time, one of the things that I was consistently almost reformed by, like it reaffirmed to me something that I would have said on paper, but I needed to keep hearing and keep experiencing myself, which is just so much about how much the heart of the pastor, the heart of the preacher has to, be right and has to be formed by the sermons themselves. And many people said that. And of course you hear that and you shrug and you say, yes, of course. But that became really true for me. How often, hearing pastors talk about how they labored over, or labored in prayer before they started their sermons, or for some of them, just the sense of longing that came through to share, what had been placed on their heart with their people felt really important. You and I talked about this a little bit even before we started, but there was one, Matt Woodley, who is probably middle of the road in terms of, not middle of the road in terms of quality.
I was
middle
like,
of the road
where are
in
you
terms
going
of
with this, man?
middle of the road in terms of the runway of all the episodes, somewhere in the middle. But I just still go back to all the time. He said there is an authority that comes with suffering, and and he was one of the more mature and wizened of the people that I interviewed. And when he said that, it felt so important to me, and I've gone back to it so many times because, really what he was saying is when you're up there preaching, people can sense when it's real for you and when it's authentic for you, and he talked about how he preached out of his own journey and out of his own suffering. That was really helpful for me. Especially because, there were a lot of ups and downs in my own life in that season too. The other really practical one that was kind of a standout for me, is I, along the way, and I've talked about this a few times. I don't remember if I ever talked about this on Sermonsmith, but certainly there were a few other podcasts I got invited on. It's something similar to this, but I developed a structure for writing sermons along the way out of my conversations in Sermonsmith that I used almost every week. And a structure meaning almost like an outline that I followed, which I was always against that. I never wanted to be the 3-point outline guy. I liked the creativity of it. And I remember early on, I was interviewing a friend of mine, a guy named Gideon Sang, who was another pastor in Austin where we were. And he talked about the value of structure. And I remember the example he always gives is he heard an interview with one of the writers for a sitcom called The Golden Girls from like 20 or 30 years ago, was also one of the writers for a sitcom called Arrested Development.
Okay.
And he said that those two sitcoms follow the same structure. Even though you would never know it, they follow the same structure of story every single episode that gets overlaid. And you wouldn't know it because there's just a lot of freedom in that. And so I came to a place where I realized it's really helpful for me to have a structure that I use for my sermons. One, for the process of putting the sermon together, because I might have all these ideas, but when I can start to see where they fit in, it matters. But also because I realized it really helped me for evaluating the sermon after the fact. If I knew what I wanted to accomplish with every sermon, some of it might go well, some of it might not go well. But rather than just base it on who said what to me afterwards, to know that I had a goal for what I wanted to communicate and that I communicated it. And certainly there were things I could have communicated better or things, that I might want to sharpen up next time. But I knew that I communicated what my goal had been to communicate. So that was probably the most significant learning for me out of the podcast. And that came through multiple conversations. There were a few different people who talked about structures that they had. And
yeah.
Well,
I just can't stop thinking about how Arrested Development and Golden Girls are the same in structure. I mean, how are they the same? What's the gist of it? Is it the hero's journey, or what's going on there?
I doubt it's the hero's journey for those two.
Okay.
I've honestly never watched an episode of Golden Girls in my life.
Okay.
I have watched quite a few of Arrested Development and always felt empty afterwards. Felt it's so empty and yet so funny. But I think he just meant like the development of, similar to the hero's journey, but just the development of the storyline, and the plot points of the third scene, this is going to be introduced, and the sixth scene, this is going to be introduced. I remember there was I'm going to go blank on it right now. There's a book that's written about writing movie scripts. It's not going to come to me, but that just talks about almost every movie you see, at the 20 to 25% mark of the movie, or maybe sooner, there needs to be some kind of inciting incident that ramps up the tension in the movie. That kind of thing,
right?
I think is the structure he was talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a surprising learning moment there,
right?
And so you essentially, it sounds like you started the podcast A, out of your own curiosity, and then B, as a way to help you to improve or to form or to find your own footing as you were preaching more regularly back in Austin. Is that right?
I wish I was that noble. It was mostly just out of my own curiosity, and then the other stuff happened along the way. I thought, there's benefits for me in this too.
Yeah. Okay, well, so was Austin the location of your first sermon that you ever preached, or
no?
Where was your first sermon?
So, Austin was my third church ministry.
Okay.
I did youth ministry for 10 or 11 years here in Arizona, where I am now. I helped start a church for 3 years up near Seattle, and then Austin. Austin was my first, lead pastor role, so to speak, where I was the main preacher. But I was on the teaching team, and in the rotation at both of our other churches. But my first, I would guess that my first sermon would have probably been in preaching classes. I went to a Bible college undergrad in Southern California. Now it's called Hope International University in Fullerton, California. At the time, it was Pacific Christian College. So, we had to preach to each other. But I don't know if this is my first, but as part of our preaching classes, they also had us go and do sermons in other churches in the community, around Orange County and Los Angeles County. Those poor people.
Yeah.
somehow their generous pastors offered up slots. Back then there were a lot of Sunday night services still happening in a lot of churches. So I have a very clear memory of driving to a church. And it was probably it was in San Fernando Valley, which from Orange County, where we were, was like an hour and a half to 2 hour drive on a Sunday. And so I remember my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, was driving. And on the way there, I totally rewrote this sermon. And so it was a sermon on putting on the armor of God. And you're yawning. Nobody else can see it, but you're yawning at 4 p.m. I feel like this is an interesting story, but maybe I need to move it along a little more quickly.
Oh man, I'm caught.
So, all right. So anyway, I had already preached this sermon on the armor of God.
Okay,
See, I wouldn't call out my own guest when I was hosting a podcast, but I'm willing to call you out when I am a guest.
I was up late doing something very noble last night. So
Yes.
I want you to know. Yes.
You did send me an email what must have been very late for you last night. I didn't realize you were up late. Anyway.
Yeah, I usually go to bed at like 8:30 or 9 o'clock, but I was up until 1 o'clock last night. So
wow.
So forgive me for yawning. I was helping. Yes, I'm just doing just think of the best thing in the world, and I was doing that.
All the grace.
Okay.
So this was a sermon that I'd already preached in class on the armor of God, and I was going to reuse it. I don't remember anything about the original sermon in class. I don't remember what kind of reviews I got, but from my peers, because we all critiqued our sermons. But we were driving up there Sunday afternoon, and for some reason I just felt like I don't know that I like what's going on with this sermon, and I'm so glad that there were no podcasts at the time, and I don't think there's any recording that exists, because on the way up there, I rewrote that sermon to somehow match up the armor of God with the imagery of Santa Claus. And somehow I matched up all of the things, because Santa Claus has boots and Santa Claus has a belt, and I don't know what I did, but somehow I likened the armor of God to the imagery of Santa Claus, because it was early December, and it just felt like, let's make this a timely sermon. And I don't know. I mean, that would not be my norm. I'm not the kind of guy who typically is going to like do a total rewrite of a sermon on the way there, but I did.
But you probably shouldn't have. That sounds
maybe not.
That sounds really stupid. I mean, is that okay? That sounds really lame.
I think it worked.
It
seems terrible. Okay. It seems terrible now to even like consider that I did that. The only feedback I remember getting was from a mom who came up with her young son, who just said he was so riveted because I was talking about Santa Claus.
Okay, well, I take back my criticism.
But it's the only time I've ever done it, for what that's worth.
Yeah. So. Oh man, and having it be December takes a little bit of the sting out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't do Santa Claus in March. It would have been likening the armor of God to the Easter Bunny, I suppose. So.
Yeah. Okay. So that was an event, and then you had 2 hours to drive back at the end of it. Was there good feedback from your girlfriend? Did she have good things to say?
I don't remember.
Okay,
maybe.
Okay.
Hey, yeah. I'm old, Mike. I mean, that would have been 30 years ago.
30 years ago. Okay. All right. All right. Well, then I guess like the next question is like, well, how have you grown since then? And obviously a lot. It's been 30 years, but maybe and then maybe this connects to another idea. But like, what did you think of preaching then? And how has your like understanding of preaching or even the sermon maybe changed over the past 30 years?
Yeah. Yeah, I really felt a lot of pressure in those early days, to put together a teaching or a sermon. The youth ministry I was part of, in my early years was a very large church, and so even then a lot of the teaching that was done was just more of a, it wasn't dialogue in nature because it was a large group. And so it was pretty much sermon format and, stand up for 30 minutes and teach. So even then, even though I was on the teaching team, but only rotated in for the whole church a few times in that ministry, a lot of the stuff I was doing was similar to sermons. And I felt a lot of pressure early on to just feel like I had something to say and that I could get it right. And a lot of pressure every time to make sure there was really something, but starting from scratch in a lot of ways each, because a topic would be assigned to me or a verse would be assigned to me and just feeling all this weight of I've got to come up with something to say for this. I even remember one time being asked to speak in the devotionals for our dorm in college and just finding somebody else like the afternoon of. It was an evening devotional, finding somebody else to fill in for me the evening of, because I was anxious about it. I didn't feel like it was coming together the way I wanted it to come together. I didn't feel like I had something to say. And I think that's the only time I ever did that. But there was definitely a pressure that I felt all the time. And somewhere along the way, something that really helped me, was to get to a place where I felt like I truly am speaking out of the overflow of learning and overflow of my own knowledge and my own experience. And I became I always read books, but somewhere along the way I became a really avid reader and really particular about capturing notes and capturing ideas and that kind of thing along the way. And so something flipped for me there. And I think it almost happened when I really did have to start teaching more regularly. For a long season in my first ministry, like I said, it was a large church, so there were multiple youth pastors on staff. And so for a long season of that, I was one of the underlings, so to speak. And I spent most of my time with either people who were my peers or my direct bosses. And so there was a lot of people, so to speak, pouring into me. And then later on, I moved into a role where I was the head of the youth ministry team. And once I was the head of the youth ministry team, suddenly I spent most of my time with people who were looking to me for leadership, and I spent much less time with people who were my peers. And that began a season for me of realizing, what does it look like for me to just cultivate more of my own care? Not that I didn't have support and care from my wife and from those above me and stuff like that, but that's when I really learned that personally I gained a lot out of spending a lot of time reading, spending a lot of time out of exploring ideas. And something switched in that season where any teaching for me, any speaking or any preaching became a lot easier because I just had all sorts of ideas already flowing, already going. And so it was more about bringing those ideas together and forming them into a teaching rather than feeling like I was starting from scratch every time and feeling all that pressure to have something specific to say about a topic that somebody else assigned to me. So that was probably my key learning that would still carry me today. Yeah.
Yeah, that seems really, really challenging. So you'd be told to speak on hope or peace or love on any given week.
Yeah.
And then you just go do it.
Right. Or Bible verse, and we'd usually know in advance, but still, in the busyness of ministry, it's not like, I'd start 4 weeks ahead. I was probably teaching at that point 2 or 3 times a month between 2 different venues that we had.
Okay.
And so, yeah, typically if I was doing our, Wednesday night quote unquote Bible study, which would have still been a large group format, there's still, maybe on Monday I'm starting work on that because I've been so big, and just all that pressure was hard.
Yeah.
It was hard for me.
Yeah. So what was some of the changes that took place? You mentioned that once you no longer had like people directly over you that were, let's say, pouring into you, to use that language, you had to develop systems of cultivating your own care. I think was the phrase that you used or something like it. What was the ways that you were cultivating care for your development in those times?
Yeah, care might be too strong of a word. I mean, care is part of it. I guess the flow of even what I'm talking about is just my own growth would probably be a better term than care. Care is something I probably learned I needed later.
Usually we have to be in our 30s before we start to see how important that is.
Yeah. Growth, I guess growth would be that as when I got to a place where rather than thinking, maybe what it came to be is I recognized I'm not just the one who has to have all the answers, and that there's a lot of benefit to me even asking questions and exploring and being curious. And so when my curiosity was piqued, and in that season, then I became energized by curiosity. I became energized by exploring, and I became energized by reading. It was about that time, and now we're probably talking about a little over 15 years ago now, but kind of in the later season of my initial, big youth ministry run there, I set a goal to just read a book a week, to average a book a week over the course of every year.
Is that right?
And I've just been maintaining that ever since. And that was really important for me. Not that books are, the primary source of all learning and growth, but for me, that just kind of became an engine, or kind of became a a garden, really might be a way to say it, of there were always new things I was learning, new ideas I was exploring that just kind of woke me and kind of brought me alive, where then preparing for teachings was more about cutting away the parts because I had more to share than I had time to share. So that's really what it was. Not care, but growth. It was finding what worked for me in terms of keeping myself energized, keeping myself rejuvenated, so I had something to teach out of, something to share out of.
Wow. And I have a feeling we'll end up talking about the care side of things in a few minutes.
I'm still learning
but
that
yeah. Well, it's, yeah, aren't we all? And yeah, I'm in my late 30s, and many of my friends are. And realizing the importance of that. And me and all my friends just turned into a bunch of really sensitive softies in the past couple of years. When previously we're gonna, charge the gates of hell and conquer and, all those things. And now we just realize, man, I just want to walk with Jesus. I just want to have a consistent, not that our goals have gotten smaller, but maybe the expectations that we have are becoming a little bit more realistic. And you're the spiritual director. I'll leave you to talk about that in a few minutes.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. So, okay. Now maybe here's a question. I didn't prep you on this one, but how have you found the difference from teaching or preaching quite regularly to youth to then teaching or preaching regularly to an adult congregation?
Yeah, so I'm going to spin your question a little bit, because a lot of it was not even the difference between speaking to youth and adults for me. A lot of it was the difference between the setting of speaking where you're just preaching as a teacher for a group. So when I was in youth ministry, most of my teaching, the mindset was, how am I going to help all of them grow in their faith? What truth do I need to share with them to have an understanding of, or what practical teaching do I need to offer them, so that they can grow spiritually? And even, in the associate pastor role I was in before our church plant, it was kind of approached the same way, although it's much more connected with the overall, direction of the church and how sermons fit in. But when I was a church planter and lead pastor, it shifted for me. And the sermon was no longer just about how am I helping people structure and form their beliefs, or how am I helping people grow spiritually or grow in maturity. The sermon became for me more about how am I forming a congregation. And so that really flipped a lot, because then I would start thinking more about, and I talked earlier about structure. For me, the primary piece of every sermon that I wanted to preach was I wanted to get to a place where I spoke some sort of calling over our congregation. We as a people are called to be this, in our time and place, which for us was, what we called North Central Austin. We are called to be a people who, and so based on whatever text we had been studying that day, I would pull out some kind of calling for us as a people. And then I would spend, some time I called it imagination, imagining what this would look like. That's where it would get more practical. So sometimes that might mean that I was talking about individual practices that we could take on. And so there was still an individual practical component to it. But sometimes that also meant, we were talking more about what does this mean for who we are trying to become, and what are the kinds of things we're going to try to do as a congregation here, because we have this calling to be this people. So rather than, so I'd say that would be the biggest difference. And it's not necessarily for me between youth ministry and speaking to adults so much as the role that I was in. It was rather than trying to form individuals, it became, what does it look like to form a congregation? What does it look like to form a people? So.
Wow. And I love that vocabulary, that shift from, okay, now I've taught you what this passage means. Okay, now it's application time. Here's some ways that we can do this passage. But imagining what it would look like for us to be a congregation shaped by these truths, and then guiding people into different ways of thinking about it. What a beautiful invitational way of painting, or as people speak about, portraying a preferred future, just showing people this could be us, or this can be you, and so let's walk in this.
Yeah. And it's interesting now. I mean, I shared with you a sermon I did recently, because the preaching I've been doing lately has been, a little bit of guest preaching here and there. And it's even that has a different dynamic to it then, because I still try to follow that same structure. I still believe that the sermon is this act of calling a community, forming an overall congregation, and then the people within it is a byproduct of that. But when you're a guest preacher and you're not the lead pastor who's like the shepherd of those people, there's just a different nuance to it that I've still tried to learn. I still try to come to people and speak over them, but I guess I do it more generalized as, Christians in our time and place, or followers of Jesus in our world today. We are called to hold this posture, or hold this, this place in society, and here's what it might look like.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So yeah, you sent me the most recent sermon that you did, which was in kind of a unique situation. It was you were zooming live,
yes,
projected onto a big sheet on the wall. And what were you seeing? Were you seeing a video of the people's faces, or were you just talking to nothing?
No, I was seeing myself.
You're seeing yourself. Cool.
Because I wasn't just seeing myself. I was in a Zoom room. So one of the cameras, so it was split. So they had the service going. It's a church plant that meets in a school. So there were a lot of people who were still, spiritually distanced or socially distanced.
Oh, okay.
Maybe spiritually distanced.
Who knows?
Socially distanced. And they were watching via Zoom, but most of them didn't have cameras on. So I had a lot of black boxes.
I see.
And then I could see myself.
I see.
And then one of the cameras was what you saw, which was
also
them
yourself.
Recording the
Yes.
service. But yes, at that point, it was just me being broadcast on the screen. So it was an interesting dynamic. And that was my first Zoom sermon. And I'm sure everybody here has empathy for me, because it's a very strange experience.
Yeah, well, I'll say this to you, and then also to everyone else who's listening. The one of the greatest things about Zoom, most people don't know about it, is called hide self view. Do you know about that? There's the 3 buttons on the top right. You tap that, and then there's either hide self view or show self view. That is a game changer. That makes things a little bit more forbearable. You can manage a little bit longer, because I find it so hard even when you're in a big group of people talking through. I'll be honest, I'm just drawn to myself. I just keep on looking at my stupid self, and to be able to turn that off helps me to be a bit more present, quote unquote present to the other people that are there. So that's
helpful.
tip.
Actually, I spend a lot of time in Zoom these days, even in meetings. So that's a beautiful idea.
I mean, even though you're in Arizona, which is like the land of the free, you guys are able to do so much stuff. It's still, Zoom is probably will be part of life for quite a long time. Yeah.
It's the land of the free, but we've chosen to be still very distanced as a family. So,
hey, cool. So you the last time you preached then was like back at the end of December, and so now we're recording this anyway, like late March. So you're not preaching too much, and so I'd like to hear like what your sermon prep rhythm looks like, even maybe as a very occasional preacher. Because not everybody who listens to the Expositors Collective preaches all the time. In fact, most of them don't. It's people that are like interested in it and are excited when they're asked to, but they're not the regular week in, week out preacher. So juggling like your regular job and then the lack of rhythm of working your way through a book or something, what does sermon prep look like as an occasional preacher?
Yeah. I mean, I would say in a lot of ways it's not a lot different from what I did before, because even when I was preaching, 3 times a month, 2 to 3 times a month in the church in Austin, I was bivocational. I worked half for the church and half time developing websites and did Sermonsmith and all that. So for me, sermon prep has always had to be, I've never been the guy who sets aside a full day and just disappear into some study cave, with piles of books and come out with a completed sermon. The pastor of the first church I worked in, the large church, he would go away for a retreat a couple times a year up to a cabin and would write 3 months worth of sermons or something like that. I had never understood how he did that. That's never been me.
Whoa.
So for me, sermon prep is more just like an ongoing, it's just a way of life, and it's a matter of being attentive to what's going on, whether it's paying attention to what's going on around me in life and things I'm thinking about. I'm always capturing thoughts and ideas, whether it's from the books that I'm reading. And so, so for me, it's one, just practically speaking, making sure I do have that system in place where I know that I'm going to be able to capture ideas as they come to me. And so a lot of times something will come to me and I can even just speak it into my watch because I can capture on my Apple Watch or something like that. Yes, there is some time that's set aside for more, intentional, deliberate study. That might mean setting aside half an hour or an hour for a few mornings to spend time just reading through a particular, commentary about the text or doing some of my own wrestling with the text and taking notes.
Okay.
But I just try to capture all of these pieces. A lot of it might even be thinking through what are other things, now I've got this, history of sermons. And like the sermon that you saw was probably a conglomeration of about 3 or 4 different sermons I'd preached at other times because I realized this would work here, but this would work together here, and so it's a matter of putting it all together. But like I said, I do have that structure. So ultimately, what it looks like for me is just making sure that there's enough runway to keep capturing some of the ideas or the fruit of the study that I do and getting all that into just a file that holds all the pieces that I might want to use. But then, a few days before the actual sermon itself, or when somebody's telling me they need the outline for their bulletin, they still had a printed quote unquote bulletin at this church that you saw my sermon for.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But so at that point, that's when I'll sit down and I'll work through, okay, how do all these pieces fit in with the structure of sermon that I like to follow? And that's where there's that efficiency for me and where it really streamlines it. And I'll just talk briefly about my structure since I've alluded to it. Like I said, I always felt like the sermon should have some kind of piece of calling, some kind of speaking collectively over the people who are there. And for me, that came out of, you mentioned the hero's journey earlier. The hero's journey, there's the part where the hero is always called to go on a journey by the prophet. And so I just kind of felt like the role of the sermon is to have the text that we're studying, not me necessarily, but have the text that we're studying or the topic that we're studying that day be that prophet, and it always calls that person out of themselves to something different, something beyond themselves. So that was my understanding of what the role of the sermon should be, that calling to everyone as a people. So I always try to get to that place first. What am I going to call people to? And then the other piece is filling around that. I would always like to begin, let me move back. I already talked about what comes after the calling, which is the imagination piece. What does it look like for us to live this out as a community or individually? But leading up to that calling piece, there would be the teaching element, and the teaching is just work through the text or work through the text's multiple if it was a more thematic sermon. And it was always helpful to have that calling piece because there's always more about a text that I want to share than everybody needs to hear or that we have time for. So knowing how I'm, trying to point that text toward the specific calling for the day, that helps me limit, because I get really nerdy, Mike. I can get really nerdy about history stuff and all that. So you've got part 2 is the teaching, part 3 is the calling, and part 4 is the imagination, which takes me back to part 1. I always tried to start a sermon with a tension. Like what is the tension that we might be feeling as a people, either culturally or that is going to be exposed in this text, but usually that tension I somehow wanted to have related to the calling that we were going to do, because it would get people thinking about it, but mostly just to get people invested. The most clear example of this one, I always think back on this one, and hindsight is way more than 2020 at this point, but in early 2016,
okay,
I was preaching a sermon, and we were doing lectionary at the time, and the text was, Revelation 4 and 5, Jesus is on the throne. And so I was preaching on that. So my tension for that day was I just put up a picture of all of the presidential candidates in the United States at that time. And I think at that point it had been whittled down to like 6. There were maybe 2 Democratic candidates left, and there were 4 Republican candidates left, I think, at that point. We all know how things went from there. But even just putting that up in our congregation in Austin was immediate tension, because that was even leading up to that, not that we were even a very split congregation politically necessarily, but we were engaged and paying attention. And so there was an immediate tension there. And my point was not that any of these people is going to be God's ordained. My point is going to be, no matter what comes of this, we celebrate today that Jesus is on the throne and we live. So yeah, that's just an example. So all that to say, for your question about what does sermon preparation look like, because I have some level of clarity about what I want to try to do in any given sermon, that I want to move through these movements, these 4 pieces to a sermon, and what the purpose of that is going to be. That really helps me with the preparation piece, because it's just slotting all these ideas that usually come to me into place.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you have like a definite goal that you're aiming towards, and then selecting what is included based on if it serves that goal. Yeah.
It's by the time I get down to it, I've got like the 4 movements over here, so to speak, in a document, and then I have all these ideas over here, and it's just starting to drag them in. Where do they fit? And there's always stuff that's over here that I really like, but it's just a little too much. Even the sermon you heard, like in hindsight, I thought, I should have just left this part out. But just knowing that then I can start to see, out of all these ideas I've had or quotes that I've had or anything like that, these are the ones that will really help me move towards this calling and move people towards where I want to get with this sermon. It's just really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, that's beautiful. I love that there's like an action piece or that imagine piece towards the end. And, editing is so hard because everything that we want to say is all good, or at least we think that it's all good,
Sure.
And it's hard. And, I think in the world of cinema, they talk about killing your darlings.
Yeah.
The director's cut versus the producer's cut. And there's good things that have to be removed for the purpose of, on the one hand, time, but then also realizing that like time is a limited resource, but also like attention is a limited resource as well too. And we want people to not be sidetracked by every interesting thing that John came across as he was considering Revelation 4 and 5. Like lots of things could be said, but what is that core, that point? Well, we've gone actually a little bit longer than I was anticipating, and some of it's due to the frequent pauses that Zoom is doing, and then some of it is due to geeking out about the inner workings of preacher sermon-based podcast stuff. But I want to end by asking you, like, so what are you doing now? What's next for John Chandler?
Yeah, and so I'll just give a little personal background on what all this transition has been and why you saw Sermonsmith fade away.
I emailed you a couple times to be like, what's happened? I miss it. Where is it?
So we, in the literally, it was like in the course of 3 months, and I won't go into all the details of it for the sake of time, but, we made the decision to leave Austin, for just health reasons. Our family with asthma and some mold stuff and all that, our family was not thriving in the reality of living in Austin, Texas.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so it was really hard. There were circumstances around it, but we just made the determination we need to live someplace else. And so that led to, leaving behind that ministry and moved back to Arizona where we'd been before and just tried to determine what's next. I worked for a nonprofit for a while, but it was at that point when we left Arizona that I put the podcast on pause. And as you know, it was very unexpected because I'm even chuckling because our initial email was I was working up towards a celebrate the 100th episode of Sermonsmith, and that's how you reached out to me initially.
Yeah.
And then I stopped at, I think, 98, 97, because it just wasn't expected. And so I really dallied for a while with, should I restart this? But not preaching enough. It felt like I couldn't have those conversations in the same way. And I was also exploring, like, am I going to go back into ministry? It felt like I did, explore positions with a few different churches and went through some interviews and all that. And I paused that after a couple because I realized, first off, any other church that I was interested in for the moment felt like a rebound girlfriend because I loved our church so dearly in Austin that we had started and the people who were there. But also just had a sense through that of, I don't know that that's what this next season is for me. Even though I deeply love ministry, and in a lot of ways I still miss it, I also know that some of my own passion and gifting doesn't perfectly fit, and especially a lot of the organizational parts of being a lead pastor. I'm more of a pastor/teacher. I'm much more interested in spiritual formation than I am interested in like organizational development. And that's valid and that's part of pastoring. But I just spent a lot of time wondering, what does this look like for me? And spiritual direction kind of came to my attention. It was something I was familiar with, but it just caught my attention as something that might be a better fit. Obviously, as somebody who does podcasts, I love to sit with people and ask questions. And I've had this growing heart. I turned 50 last year.
Okay.
And so, you start asking questions about, how can I now take my experience? How can I now take my seasoning? I don't feel old, but I feel a little more seasoned. How can I take some of my life experience in a way that's going to be beneficial and valuable to others? Read a book called Sacred Fire by Ronald Rolheiser, which you can't read it in your 20s. It'd be wasted on you. But for you, I would strongly recommend it.
Am I okay?
In your late 30s.
I'm on the cusp of getting it.
Yeah, no, I think definitely now. But so yeah. And so ultimately right now I'm in training to be a spiritual director, and I'm really hoping to cultivate a practice of spiritual direction that primarily focuses on people who are in spiritual leadership roles, maybe in faith-based nonprofits or people who are in ministry. I've just had a growing heart for that, for the loneliness of that role, for the pressures of that role, but also because it's unlike any other role, like the nature of true pastoring. And I think this is going to be, I hope we see the church return more and more to pastors are seen as, spiritual leaders who are partnering with God and forming a people to partner with God, rather than this. And this sounds cynical, and I don't mean it to sound cynical at all, because I know there are a lot of really beautiful hearted, good pastors, but I think that the church has become such a, the whole celebrity pastor idea, all of that, the role of pastor has been disrupted a little bit in a not a good way. And I would love to see and love to be a part of helping the role of pastor once again be, spiritually formed people who are partnering with God and leading congregations. And so I'd love to be a part of helping that happen. And spiritual direction for me is a way that I hope I can help offer that.
Yeah. And is this a location specific type of ministry? Is this can you foresee it being face to face for Arizona residents, or is this something that the broad listeners to this podcast could avail of?
Yeah, I think it'll be both. I think I've been surprised by, I've done some, during COVID, I've done some, therapy and counseling, over Zoom, and been surprised that that's been more effective than I thought it could be. I've done spiritual direction over Zoom. I don't think it's the best, like I think embodied presence is always better. So I'm hoping to have a practice that kind of does both. I wouldn't say no to meeting with somebody in Louisiana. I don't know why that came to mind. It just was the first state that came to my mind. So,
hey, you Louisiana listeners, the Lord is coming for you.
Yeah.
Get in touch with John.
I do hope to be available to offer, spiritual direction over Zoom for people. But I also really hope to be able to meet with people, and whether that's do on-site intensives or, go meet with pastors in their office or meet with people in my home office. I'm going to be open to all of it. I'm still finishing my training right now. I have another year of that. So right now I'm just doing limited, quote unquote, practice spiritual direction.
Oh, I see. Okay.
With people while I finish up my training and start that practice. So alongside that, and you and I talked about this earlier, but I do have another podcast, Incubating, which hopefully by the time, this comes out will be available. And I will actually post on sermonsmith.com when that other one launches. So if anyone's interested in that, they can find it. But it's going to be really a tweak of Sermonsmith, because I'm still mostly going to interview pastors and faith leaders. But rather than talking about habits for sermon preparation, I'm going to talk about habits. The way I would say it is habits for partnering with God. Like what is your life? What are your rhythms that are helping you as a spiritual leader stay partnered, with God, and the soul care that's required for that, the continuing formation and growth that's required for that. So, yeah, that's, like I say, that's incubating, but I hope that's going to be getting started here in the next few months, maybe by the time you publish this.
Yeah, so listeners, go check the show notes. Maybe there's a link that will bring you right there, or maybe not. Who knows?
I would even say the name, but I'm only 80% set on the name right now. So,
and if you don't have the domain purchased, then maybe you should just keep that to yourself.
I have multiple domains purchased, Mike.
Oh yeah, you're one of those guys. You're one of those website guys that just yeah. How many domains do you own right now?
Well, there's probably 25 or 30. So.
Yeah. I know guys like you collecting domains. Okay. All right. Well, yeah. So if it's not out by the time that this releases, we'll definitely, lend our social media support, tweet out a link, to connect people, to this. Maybe this is just maybe there's somebody listening to this who is just on the edge of their seat, because in certain traditions, this is not something that's really talked about. There's, therapy if you get in real big trouble, right. And even that is a misnomer. That's not the right way but people think of it like that. And then otherwise you just kind of struggle along. But you're perhaps introducing this category to some that maybe have never considered it. So thank you for doing that. And maybe somebody in Louisiana or elsewhere will reach out.
Maybe so.
Well, John, thank you so much. Thanks for, on the one hand, for your time now, but also thank you for personally for the 97 episodes that you have enriched me with. And hopefully, too, if you're listening now and if you like the Expositors Collective, then you're going to love Sermonsmith. And you have 97 fresh episodes you've never heard before. And you should really check them out.
Yeah.
Cool. So, John, thank you so much for, again, the past and present. And for the listener, I hope that this episode and all that we do at the Expositors Collective helps you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. Love what you're doing here.
Well, thanks so much, John, for your openness and your honesty. It's exciting to hear about the upcoming Spiritual Direction podcast. If it's anything like the Sermonsmith, I know it's going to be great. And keep connected to us on social media. And as soon as this podcast is launched, you'll hear about it from us. So once again, thanks, John. And for the listeners, you can check out the show notes. There'll be links to previous Sermonsmith episodes. Like I said, there's like 97 episodes that are waiting for you to discover. Sadly, there won't be any more after 97, but hopefully we're carrying the torch here with the Expositors Collective. So you've been invited to the CGN International Conference, and I hope that many of you are able to make it there. That's in the month of June. But looking ahead in your calendars, here is an invitation for you to make it out to the Expositors Collective Training Weekend taking place in the month of September. So I hope that this episode and the training weekends and all that we do help you to grow in your personal study and your public proclamation of God's Word. God bless.
Hello, this is Pastor Eric Cartier from Rocky Mountain Calvary. I want to invite you to come join us for the Expositors Collective in September. We're hosting it here in Colorado Springs. It's a beautiful setting right by the mountains, but more importantly, this is a great time to be able to get equipped to teach God's Word. What I love most about the Expositors Collective is its focus on young people. For God to really raise up the next generation to communicate God's Word. We've never needed God's truth more than now. So if you're thinking about coming, consider yourself invited. We'd love to have you. It's going to be a great time.